The war that lasted centuries, and no one noticed. It began with a misunderstanding. That's how most wars start. But this one didn't have a clear beginning. No official declaration, no grand speeches, just a quiet insult, whispered between two merchants on a muddy road, the kind that's forgotten before the sun sets. But it wasn't forgotten. A ship was seized, a cargo confiscated. Someone's honor was questioned. Someone else's debt was refused. And before anyone knew it, flags were hoisted, cannonballs were loaded, and two distant nations became enemies without ever facing each other directly. Across the gray sea, the merchants of Valeria whispered that their rivals in Faradon were nothing but thieves, liars, cheats. They said it in the markets, in the taverns, and soon they said it in letters. Letters that found their way to the courts, to the ears of men who had never seen the muddy road where the quarrel began. The kings didn't care at first. Why would they? It was a merchant's quarrel, a trading dispute, the kind that rises and fades like smoke. But then, the letters kept coming. Accusations turned to threats. Threats turned to fines. Fines turned to blockades. In the bustling ports of Valeria, Faradon's ships were turned away. Merchants shouted, sailors cursed. In Faradon, Valerian traders were taxed to ruin, their goods seized, their warehouses searched. And still, neither king bothered to call it a war. Because wars were fought with armies. Wars were declared with banners and blood. But this was different. It was a war of ships, a war of letters, a war of whispers. And so it didn't end. The first real clash happened at sea. A Valerian ship, the Golden Star, was caught in the mist, her sails wet with rain, her crew shivering beneath the gray sky. They didn't see the Faradon frigate until it was too late. Cannons roared, sails tore, men screamed. The Golden Star was boarded, her cargo seized, her crew imprisoned. But the captains exchanged no words. No one spoke of nations. Just orders barked in the wind, steel against steel, the cold splash of bodies falling into the waves. When news reached Valeria, the merchants were furious. They wrote letters, demanded action, petitioned the court. But the king simply smiled, sipped his wine, and said it was a matter of the seas. But the merchants didn't forget. Neither did Faradon. Soon, a dozen ships were seized, then 100. Valerian traders began hiring armed escorts. Faradon captains armed their merchant fleets. Iron cannons bolted to their decks, swords at their sides. But it wasn't a war. Not yet. Because there were no battlefields, no generals, just letters, just ships. But people were dying. On the docks of Valeria, sailors whispered that Faradon was cursed, that their captains were pirates, their merchants cutthroats. Faradon's ports told the same stories, just in reverse, that Valeria was a nest of thieves, a kingdom of liars and cowards. When a Valerian merchant was found dead in his own warehouse, his throat cut, they said it was a Faradon assassin. When a Faradon ship burned in the harbor, they whispered of Valerian saboteurs. But no one knew for sure. The war lived in the shadows. A quiet, growing hatred, a slow poisoning of minds. Men took sides without ever understanding the cause. Ships were painted in the colors of their cities, but no one dared fly the flags of their nations, because to do so would be to admit that this was a war. And no one wanted to admit that, because wars end. But this didn't end. Not after the first year, not after the 5th. The kings remained silent, not because they were wise, but because they didn't care. As long as their treasuries grew, as long as their cities thrived, the conflict at sea was just noise. A distant bickering among merchants, a storm on the horizon that never reached the throne. But the merchants knew better. They hired mercenaries, privateers. They signed secret agreements, hired spies, paid bribes. Captains spoke in code, changed the colors of their sails, sailed under false names. It wasn't a war, but it killed like one. And the sailors knew. They whispered of cursed waters, of ghost ships that sailed without flags, of captains who vanished, of crews who were never seen again. In the taverns, men told stories of the endless sea, of how a sailor could serve a king without ever knowing it, how a man could die for a cause without ever seeing its face. In the royal courts, the whispers were different. They spoke of profits, of new trade routes, of fortunes won and lost on the waves. But still, they didn't call it a war, because wars could be won or lost. This was just business. 5 years passed and the fighting changed. It wasn't just ships anymore, not just cargo seized or captains killed in the mist. Now it was ports, entire harbors blockaded, warehouses burned in the night, dock workers beaten in the alleys, their bodies found floating in the canals. In Faradon, merchants whispered that Valeria's gold was cursed, that every coin carried a promise of betrayal. Faradon's captains began hiring armed guards, mercenaries with scars and quiet smiles, men who asked no questions but sharpened their blades in the moonlight. Valeria answered in kind. Their ships sailed in convoys now, bristling with cannon, painted in dark colors to blend with the fog. Valerian traders paid pirates for protection, cut secret deals with island captains who knew the hidden coves, the narrow straits where Faradon's ships might be caught and crushed. But it still wasn't a war, because the kings didn't say so. The kings met once, in a grand hall lined with silver mirrors and velvet drapes. They smiled, drank sweet wine, exchanged polite lies about peace and prosperity. But when their ministers met in shadowed corridors, they spoke of gold, of roots, of how the sea had become a blade pressed against their kingdom's throats. "It is not a war," the king of Valeria told his advisors, his voice calm, his eyes cold. "It is business. We protect our merchants. We protect our wealth." Across the sea, the king of Faradon said the same. "Business, only business." But they knew, and so did their captains. The ships changed. Sleek, low-decked galleons with iron-shod rams, painted in dark hues. Crews drilled with muskets, blades sharpened to a mirror's edge. Cannonades roared in the mist, and ships vanished beneath the waves without a trace. Ports closed at dusk, torches burned along the docks, and sailors whispered prayers to old gods before setting sail. Because the sea was no longer a road, it was a graveyard. Valerian merchants hired spies in Faradon's ports. Faradon's captains bribed Valerian guards. Letters were written in cipher, maps drawn in code. The price of salt doubled, the price of silk tripled, and the price of iron was measured in blood. A storm at sea wasn't just bad luck. It was sabotage. A ship delayed wasn't just late. It was captured. And when a Valerian merchant's son was found dead in a Faradon alley, his throat slit, his hands bound, the whispers grew louder. The merchant sailed to the king's court, demanded justice, demanded vengeance. But the king simply smiled. "Business," he said, sipping his wine. "Only business." In Faradon, a warehouse burned. Dozens died, the flames turning the night sky orange. The merchants whispered of Valerian spies, of sabotage, of revenge. But the king only shrugged. Merchants quarrel. Ships sink. Cities burn. This is the way of trade. But the captains knew better. They saw the war in the blood on the decks, in the fear in their men's eyes. They watched the flags change, the colors shift, the names of ships whispered in the dark like secrets. And they fought. They fought in the mist, in the storm, in the narrow channels where cannon smoke hung like fog. They fought with grappling hooks, with pistols, with knives pressed against throats in the rain. But no one called it a war, because wars had rules. This was just chaos. The years turned to decades. Generations of captains learned to read the signs, the slashed sails in the mist, the red lantern hung from a mast, the silence that meant a trap was waiting. Valerian captains learned to sail without lights, to cut their flags, to hide their cargo in hidden holds. Pharadon's ships sailed in pairs, armed to the teeth, ready to kill at the first sight of a strange sail. Merchants in the ports spoke of fortunes won and lost. Families rose and fell with the price of iron and the weight of silk. Valerian merchants grew rich, selling Pharadon's stolen spices. Pharadon's traders grew wealthy on Valerian silver, bought cheap from sinking ships. But it wasn't just traders. The kings grew rich too. Taxes swelled. Armies grew fat with new weapons. Ports were fortified. Harbors lined with cannon. The wealth of the sea flooded into the palaces, and the kings smiled. "It is not a war," they told their ministers. "It is simply business." But the letters never stopped. Letters from captains, written in shaking hands. Letters from merchants, written in blood. Letters from sailors' widows, begging for justice, for peace, for anything but silence. And the silence was all they received. The sea became a graveyard. The names of ships changed, but the bones beneath the waves did not. Wrecks drifted, tangled in seaweed. Cannonballs lay scattered on the ocean floor, rusted and forgotten, and the stories twisted, tangled, changed. A child in Valeria grew up hearing that Pharadon was a nation of pirates, thieves, murderers who killed for gold. A child in Pharadon grew up hearing that Valeria was a nest of vipers, a kingdom of liars who broke their oaths. But neither child knew the truth, that there had never been a declaration, no treaty, no single battle. Just the sea, hungry and silent. Just the ships, vanishing beneath the waves. Just the merchants, counting gold in shadowed halls. And the kings, smiling over their wine, saying, "It is not a war." 50 years had passed, half a century of whispers and blood, of shattered masts and silent harbors. And still it wasn't called a war. But everyone knew. The sailors who kissed their children goodbye, knowing they might never return. The merchants who paid for armed escorts, their ledgers stained with bribes and blood money. The priests who whispered prayers for the lost, their altars lined with silver coins from widows. It was a war without a name, a war that never ended, because no one ever admitted it began. Valeria's ports glittered with silver, her docks crowded with ships bearing false flags, armed to the teeth. Pharadon's harbors swarmed with privateers, captains who sailed for gold and glory, who fought and bled without knowing why. The sea was a graveyard, and the wind carried whispers of death. But the kings still smiled. The king of Valeria grew old, his beard white, his hands thin and spotted. He sat in his golden hall, listening to his ministers whisper of profits, of silk and silver, of ships taken and ships lost. "It is business," the old king whispered, his voice dry as dust. "Only business." His ministers nodded, their eyes sharp, their fingers counting coins even as they spoke of losses. But the king's son was different. Young, bold, restless. He saw the maps, the red lines drawn across the sea, the dark stains that marked where Valerian ships had vanished. "This is war," the prince whispered to his father. "A quiet war, a hidden war, but a war all the same." The old king laughed. "War is fought with armies. This is the game of merchants. They play, they lose, they win, and the kingdom grows fat." But the prince didn't smile. Across the sea in Pharadon, the story was the same. The old king sipped sweet wine, listened to his ministers whisper of gold and spices, of ships captured and crews lost. "It is not a war," he told them, his fingers tapping the arm of his gilded chair. "It is opportunity." But his daughter saw the truth. Her father's ships sailed under false flags. Their captains wore steel beneath their cloaks. Their merchants spoke in code, carried daggers beneath their silks. And the docks were lined with widows. "This is not business," she whispered. "It is blood. It is death. And one day, it will burn us all." But the old king laughed. "Burn? No, child. It is the fire that warms us. As long as the gold flows, as long as the ships sail, we are safe." But the princess didn't smile. The sea didn't care about kings. It didn't care about merchants or ministers or titles. It swallowed men without asking their names, buried them beneath waves dark as iron, their bodies tangled in seaweed, their coins scattered across the ocean floor. And the captains knew. They saw it in the gray mist that curled around their sails, in the faint glow of lanterns lost in the fog, in the silence that swallowed the screams of drowning men. A Valerian galleon, the Sapphire Crown, sailed with a crew of 50, her hull lined with iron, her cannons loaded with iron shot. She never made port. A Pharadon brigantine, the Silver Flame, disappeared in a stormless night, her sails torn, her deck littered with broken blades. When a fishing boat found her, she was empty. Not a soul aboard, not a trace of blood, only silence. But still, it wasn't a war, not by name. Because the kings didn't say so. The Prince of Valeria stood by the harbor, watching the ships come and go. He saw the black sails of the privateers, the gold-laden barges guarded by armed galleys. He saw the merchants whispering in the shadows, their hands slick with ink and greed. "This cannot last," he told his father. "One day this will come to us. This blood will wash onto our shores." But the old king only smiled. "Fear is the weapon of the poor, my son. We are not poor. We are rich because of this chaos." "But it is chaos," the prince said, his hands curling into fists. "Ships vanish, crews die, gold is stolen. It may be business to you, but to them, it is war." "Then let them fight it," the king whispered, "so long as they die at sea and not in our streets." In Pharadon, the princess watched her father's captains sharpen their blades. She listened to the merchants speak in hushed tones, whispering of lost cargo, of drowned sailors, of the ghosts that walked the waves. She watched the towers of the capital glitter in the sunset, gold and glass, beautiful and empty. "Father," she whispered, "what if they bring the war here?" But the old king laughed. "Here, to Pharadon. Nonsense. We are the heart of the trade. We are the masters of the sea. Let the blood spill on the waves so long as our coffers grow." "But the blood does not stay at sea," the princess whispered. "It follows us home. It always does." But the king waved her away, sipped his wine, and smiled. And so the blood followed. A Valerian captain, betrayed by his Pharadon partners, sailed his ship into the harbor at dawn, his decks lined with men in black armor, his cannons loaded with iron and flame. He fired on the docks, tore through the merchant ships, shattered the piers. Flames roared, smoke twisted in the gray morning sky. "It is a warning!" he shouted to the merchants fleeing the blaze. "A warning from the men you left to die in the mist!" But when the harbor guards arrived, they cut him down, threw his crew to the sea. And in Valeria, the news spread. A Valerian ship attacked by Pharadon's guards, a Valerian captain killed without trial. The prince stood before his father, his voice cold as the sea. "This is war." But the old king shook his head. "Number, it is business." "But it is our men who die," the prince whispered. "Our ships that burn." "Ships are made of wood," the king said, his voice a tired whisper. "Men are born to die." The prince stared at his father, his chest burning with rage. But the old king only turned away. And across the sea, in Pharadon, The princess watched the smoke rise over the harbor, and she knew
Smoke over Faradon's
the
harbor
war
didn't
was coming
fade.
home. It spread. It twisted in the wind, drifting over the rooftops, staining the white sails of ships that tried to flee. Charred beams fell into the water, embers dancing on the waves. But the flames weren't just in the harbor. They were in the hearts of the merchants, in the whispers that spread through the crowded streets. A Valyrian attack, they muttered. A raid. Pirates in our own waters. But it wasn't pirates. It was revenge. Cold. Calculated. Delivered by men who wore no flags, who carried no banners, who fought and bled without names. Faradon's captains whispered of treachery. They painted their ships black, flew false colors, sailed with iron at their belts and pistols beneath their coats. The merchants paid for guards. Armed men patrolled the docks, their faces hidden beneath iron helms. Spies moved through the crowded taverns, listening, watching, reporting. But the fear didn't stop, because the war was no longer a shadow on the waves. It was here, in the alleys, in the crowded marketplaces, in the whispers that slipped beneath closed doors, and the king still laughed. Business, he whispered, sipping his sweet wine. They kill, they trade, they steal. But the gold flows, and as long as the gold flows, we are safe. But his daughter didn't smile, because she saw the merchants arming their ships, saw the captains drilling their crews, their eyes sharp, their swords gleaming in the torchlight. She saw the fear in their eyes, and fear is a fire. In Valyria, the news of the harbor's burning spread like lightning. Some called it justice, some called it madness, but none could deny it. Ships sailed out of the mist and attacked without warning. Docks were burned, warehouses looted, and the gold flowed in rivers of blood. The prince stood on the cliffside, watching the horizon, his hands clenched behind his back. "It will come here," he whispered. "The sea is not a barrier. It is a road, and they will follow it." The king chuckled, waving his hand. "Let them follow. Let them drown. We are Valyria. Our ships are many. Our gold is endless." But the prince turned, his eyes sharp. "Your gold will burn, father. Your ships will sink, because you call this business. But to them, it is war." The king's smile faded just a little. "Your tongue is sharp, boy. But the world is not so simple. Men kill. Men die. Ships burn. And in the end, only gold remains." "Only ash remains," the prince whispered, turning away. The ships of Valyria sailed under dark colors now. No crests, no banners, only iron and flame. They hunted in packs, struck in the mist, vanished into the storm. Faradon answered with iron-clad galleons, their hulls lined with cannon, their captains sworn to sink any Valyrian ship they saw. But not a single declaration was signed. No king raised a flag. No ambassadors spoke of peace. The merchants bled, the sailors died, the cities whispered of betrayal, of revenge. But the kings sipped their wine and smiled. "It is business," they said. But the captains knew the truth. The war changed. It became a war of blades in the alleys, of poison slipped into goblets, of whispered secrets sold in darkened rooms. In Faradon, a Valyrian merchant was found dead in his bed. A black mark burned into his palm. His gold vanished. His servants fled. In Valyria, a Faradon ship burned in the harbor, her cargo stolen, her captain hanging from the mast. "It is not a war," the old king whispered, his voice thin, his fingers tapping the golden throne. "It is business." But the prince didn't listen. He met in secret with the captains, men of iron, men with scars, men who sailed the black waters without fear. "Fight them," he whispered. "Hunt them, sink them, but do not return empty-handed." And the captains smiled, their eyes dark. Bring me their gold. Bring me their blood. Across the sea, in Ferredon, the princess watched the docks burn, watched the merchant fleet scatter, their sails torn, their masts splintered. She stood beside her father, her face pale, her eyes cold. "This is not business, father, it is madness." But the old king laughed. "Madness is for the poor. We are rich, child. This is the game of kings." But the princess shook her head. "It is a game of corpses." The streets of Ferredon grew tense. Spies whispered of Valerian assassins, of gold exchanged for blood. Guards patrolled the markets, their eyes sharp, their swords drawn. But the ships kept burning. A Valerian merchant ship vanished in the night, her crew never seen again. A Ferredon captain was dragged from his carriage, his body left hanging from the city gates. And still, it wasn't a war. Because the kings didn't say so, because the gold still flowed. But the gold smelled of smoke. The Prince of Valeria didn't wait for his father's orders. He armed the fleet, forged new alliances, hired mercenaries from the southern isles, men who fought for silver and asked no questions. He sent his ships to the straits, cut the trade routes, blockaded the Ferredon ports. The merchants screamed, the dock workers rioted, the captains bled. "It is business," the old king whispered, his hands shaking, his voice thin. "Business." But the prince didn't listen. The princess of Ferredon took no chances. She paid the captains in gold, promised bounties for every Valerian ship sunk. Her spies whispered of secret deals, of hidden routes, of ships that sailed without lights. And in the mist, the war spread. But it was no longer whispers. It was fire. It was iron. It was men drowned in the dark. A Ferredon ship, the Stormlight, caught a Valerian convoy at dawn. Her cannons roared, her iron hull crushed the lighter ships. Flames twisted in the mist, smoke choked the air. The captains shouted, the sailors screamed. But there was no mercy. When the sun rose, the waves were red. The princess watched from the cliffs, her cloak whipping in the wind, her jaw clenched. And she knew. Her father had played at games, but now it was her war, because the fire was already here. The war moved faster than whispers. Ferredon's merchants spoke of blockades, of ships burning in the mist, of captains who never returned. The markets grew quiet. The docks emptied at dusk. Ships sailed with iron-shod hulls, their crews armed to the teeth. But no one called it a war, because the kings didn't say so. In the shadowed halls of Ferredon's palace, the princess met with captains, spies, and mercenaries. Maps covered the long table, marked with ink and blood. Lines drawn and redrawn, routes scrawled in hurried hand. "Cut their trade routes," she whispered, her voice cold. "Hunt their ships. Sink them, but leave no trace." Her captains nodded. Grim faces, scarred hands. Men who fought for silver, who killed without question. "They want our gold," she whispered. "Give them iron." And the captains sailed. They struck in the mist, in the narrow channels where the wind turned treacherous, where the rocks hid beneath the waves. Valerian ships were caught, boarded, burned, their crews drowned or left adrift, their cargoes taken. And in Valeria, the whispers grew louder. The Prince of Valeria stood by the docks, his gaze cold, his jaw clenched. He watched the smoke on the horizon, the ships limping into port, their sails torn, their decks scorched. "Ferredon," his captains whispered. "They're hunting us. They sail without colors, but their gold buys blades." "Then burn them," the prince whispered. "Burn their harbors, sink their fleets." The old king tried to protest. "This is madness. We are traitors, not conquerors." "We are dead if we do nothing," the prince snapped. "This is not business. This is survival." The old king slumped in his chair, his fingers trembling. Business. It is business. But the prince didn't listen. He met with the merchants, the captains, the spies who whispered of hidden routes, of secret deals made in shadowed taverns. He hired privateers, men who fought for gold, who sailed under no flag but their own. He armed the merchant fleets, forged new cannons, paid for iron and steel. "Bring me their ships," he whispered. "Bring me their gold. Bring me their blood." And the captains smiled. The sea turned black. Ships vanished in the mist, their sails slashed, their hulls shattered. Men whispered of ghost ships, of vessels that sailed without lights, that struck without warning. Faradon's galleons hunted the merchant convoys, their iron cannons roaring in the dawn mist. Valeria's privateers struck at the ports, burned the docks, left wreckage drifting in the harbor. But there were no flags, no banners, no names, only whispers. The merchants locked their doors, the dock workers carried knives, and the captains sailed with iron at their belts, never sleeping without a blade beneath their pillow. The prince stood by the cliffs watching the horizon, the gray waves stained with ash. "It is war," he whispered. "They will bring it to our shores." But the old king only shook his head. "Gold is all that matters, as long as the gold flows." But the gold smelled of smoke. In Faradon, the princess watched her father's city darken. The markets closed early. The ships docked with scorched hulls, their sails blackened, their decks stained with blood. But the old king laughed. "Business," he whispered. "We are still rich. We are still strong." But the princess knew the truth. She met with her captains in the candle-lit halls, her voice sharp, her eyes fierce. "Cut their trade, bleed them, strike in the night, vanish before the dawn." Her captains nodded, their faces grim. They sailed without names, without colors, hunting the Valerian ships, striking in the mist. A Valerian convoy, 6 ships strong, was caught in the northern straits. Faradon's galleons tore them apart, their iron hulls crashing through the lighter ships, their cannons shredding sails, cracking masts. The sea burned, and in Valeria the whispers turned to screams. The prince ordered the fleet doubled. The docks rang with the sound of hammers, of iron being forged, of ships armored with steel. He paid for mercenaries, hired pirates, bribed Faradon's captains to turn on their own. Coins changed hands in dark alleys. Letters were written in cipher, carried by trusted messengers. But the ships kept burning. In the shadowed taverns of Faradon, merchants whispered of a Valerian prince, a man who fought like a pirate, who paid in silver, who burned ships without mercy. And in Valeria they whispered of a Faradon princess, a woman who hunted like a wolf, who paid for blood, who commanded ships of iron. But no one called it a war, because the kings didn't say so. In Faradon, the princess walked the burning docks, her cloak whipping in the wind. She saw the bodies pulled from the waves, the smoke twisting into the gray sky. "Business," her father whispered, his voice thin, his eyes dull. "Only business." But the princess didn't answer, because she saw the fear in the captain's eyes, saw the gold stained with blood, saw the merchants whispering in shadowed alleys. "It is war," she whispered, staring at the smoke, "and it will burn us all." The prince watched his city darken. He saw the ships drift into port, burned, shattered, their crews dead or dying. He walked among the wounded, his cloak trailing in the ash, his voice cold. "Fight," he whispered. "Fight, or we die." But his father only slumped in his golden chair, his fingers tapping, his eyes empty. "Business. Just business." The prince didn't listen. He ordered the fleet armed, the ships painted black, their sails dark as storm clouds. He met with his captains, spoke of victory, of vengeance. But the captains whispered of ghosts, of ships that vanished in the mist, of ferries that never reached their shores. And the sea turned black. In the mist, the ships fought without flags, without names. Cannons roared, iron shattered, men drowned in the cold waves. A Pharadon galleon caught a Valerian frigate, her iron hull crushing the smaller ship, her cannons shredding the sails. But a second Valerian ship struck from the mist, boarding in the chaos, blades flashing in the smoke, blood stained the decks, bodies fell to the waves, and in the shadows the whispers grew. A war without end, a war without kings, a war where men died without knowing why. But the Prince of Valeria knew, the Princess of Pharadon knew, and the blood followed them home. The sky over Pharadon was stained gray. Smoke curled above the rooftops, twisting like a serpent in the wind. The princess walked the docks, her cloak pulled tight, her eyes sharp, her face pale. "Who did this?" she whispered. The dockmaster, a nervous man with ink-stained fingers, shook his head. "We don't know, Your Highness. They came at dawn. Black sails, no flags. They fired, they boarded, they burned. And then they vanished." The princess stared at the scorched beams, the shattered crates, the bodies pulled from the waves. Her fingers curled into fists. "Valeria," she whispered. "It's always Valeria." Her captains stood behind her, silent, their faces grim. Men who had fought a dozen battles without names. Men who had killed without question, who had bled for gold and glory. "Arm the fleet," she whispered. "No more trade convoys, no more escorts. We hunt them now, we hunt them all." The captains nodded, their eyes cold, but one hesitated. An old sailor, his beard white, his hands scarred. "Your Highness, the men, they speak of shadows, of ships that vanish, of storms that strike without warning." The princess's jaw tightened. Fear is their weapon. Cut it from them. Burn their ships, sink their captains, and the fear will die with them. But the old sailor didn't look convinced, because the fear didn't die. It grew. Across the sea in Valeria, the prince stood by the cliffs, the wind tearing at his cloak. His captain spoke of victories, of Pharadon's ships burning, of merchants lost in the mist. But the prince saw the wreckage, saw the ships that limped home, their decks scorched, their sails torn, saw the men carried ashore on stretchers, their faces pale, their bodies twisted with fear. "Pharadon strikes harder," his captains whispered. "They sail without warning, they kill without mercy. They hunt us." "Then we hunt them," the prince whispered, his voice cold. "We find them, we break them, we burn their cities." His father, the old king, sat slumped in his golden chair, his eyes dull, his fingers twitching. "Business," the old king muttered. "It is business." But the prince ignored him, because it wasn't business anymore. It was war. The fleets grew. The ships changed. No longer sleek trading vessels, but ironclad monsters, bristling with cannon, their decks lined with steel. Crews wore iron helms, carried swords and pistols. The holds filled not with silk and spices, but with powder and shot. And the captains whispered of death, of ships that sailed without lights, of shadowed galleons that drifted in the mist, of whispers that twisted in the wind, of men who screamed before the cannons fired. But they sailed, because the gold still flowed and because they had no choice. The Princess of Pharadon watched her fleet gather. Iron and wood, sails dark as storm clouds. Her captains spoke of victory, of vengeance, but she saw the fear in their eyes, saw the gold stained with blood. "Fight them," she whispered. "Take their ships, burn their harbors, leave nothing but ashes." Her captains nodded, grim, silent, men who had killed and died for silver. But the fear followed them, and the fear bled. The Valerian fleet struck at dawn. Black sails in the mist, cannons roaring, iron smashing through wood. A Pharadon convoy shattered beneath the iron hulls. Sailors screamed, their bodies swept beneath the waves. But it wasn't enough. Because Pharadon's fleet struck back. Ironclads swept through the mist, their guns roaring, their decks lined with soldiers. Valerian ships vanished in the smoke, their masts shattered, their captains drowned. The sea turned red, and in the mist the whispers grew. Men spoke of ghost ships, of captains who never aged, of sails that burned but never sank. They spoke of shadows that twisted through the fog, of whispers that froze the blood. But the gold still flowed. So they fought. The prince stood in his war room, the maps spread before him, the candles burning low. His captains spoke of losses, of ships lost in the night, of crews taken and never seen again. "We have them," the prince whispered, his voice a fierce hiss. "We have them bleeding. They are desperate. Push them. Break them." But his captains didn't meet his eyes, because they knew the truth. The sea was a graveyard, and they were the ghosts. The princess watched the smoke twist over Pharadon's harbor. She listened to the captains argue, their voices sharp, their hands clenched. "They are too strong," one whispered. "Their ships strike in the mist. Their captains take no prisoners." "Then we fight in the mist," the princess whispered. "We strike first. We burn them. We show them fear." But the captains whispered of Valerian ships that drifted like shadows, of men who never spoke, who struck without warning. "It is madness," one whispered. "We are dying in the dark." The princess's jaw tightened. "Then die well." But in her heart, she knew. They were already dying. The battles blurred together, mist and blood, smoke and iron. Ships shattered against iron hulls, cannonballs roared, swords flashed in the rain. Men died without names, their bodies swept beneath the waves. A Pharadon captain struck at a Valerian convoy, tore through the merchant ships, but was caught by ironclads that rose from the mist, their cannons blazing. A Valerian privateer burned a Pharadon dock, slaughtered the dock workers, left their bodies hanging from the piers. The sea turned red, and the whispers never stopped. The Prince of Valeria met his captains, his voice cold, his eyes sharp. "Burn their ports, sink their fleets, leave them nothing." But his captains whispered of shadows, of ships that vanished, of men who drowned in the dark. "They hunt us," they whispered. "They watch. They wait." "Then we kill them," the prince whispered. "All of them." The princess walked the burning docks, her voice cold, her eyes hard. "Sink their ships, bleed them dry, burn their cities." But her captains whispered of fear, of ships that came from the mist, that struck without warning. "They are everywhere," one whispered, "and we are dying." The princess stared at the burning sea, her jaw clenched. "Then die well." But she knew the truth. They were already dead. Because the war was not just on the waves. It was in the shadows. It was in the whispers. It was a graveyard. It was in the waves washed over the shattered hulls of ships, driftwood scattered across the gray waters, bodies floating face down, their hands twisted in death. Smoke twisted in the mist, rising from the burned wrecks, fading into the pale sky. But it didn't end. Because neither side would stop. The Prince of Valeria stood on the cliffside, the wind tearing at his cloak, his eyes cold and empty. He watched the ships burn on the horizon, watched the plumes of smoke twist like serpents in the air. "Burn them," he whispered. "Sink them. Don't stop until they have nothing left." His captains nodded, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. Men who had fought a dozen battles, who had killed without question, who had lost friends and fortunes. But they were tired, because the sea was a graveyard, and the whispers never stopped. The Princess of Farad'n stood on the docks, the smoke stinging her eyes, the ash drifting through the wind. She watched the ships return, the ones that survived, their sails scorched, their decks stained with blood. "Strike first," she whispered. "Strike hard. Take their ships. Take their gold. Make them bleed." But her captains didn't smile, because they knew the truth. They were dying, but they sailed, because the gold still flowed, because the whispers never stopped. The ships changed again, no longer sleek, elegant vessels, but iron-clad monsters bristling with cannon, their decks lined with steel, their crews silent and armed. The captains changed too, no longer merchants, but killers, men who sailed without names, who struck without warning, who killed without mercy. The sea was a battlefield, a fog-shrouded wasteland where shadows twisted in the mist, where cannon fire roared like thunder, where screams were swallowed by the wind. Valerian convoys sailed in packs, armed to the teeth, their captains sworn to fight to the last. Farad'n's ironclads prowled the waves, their cannons blazing, their decks lined with soldiers in black. And men died in the mist, their bodies swept beneath the waves, their names forgotten. And the gold still flowed. In Valeria, the prince sat in the war room, the maps spread before him, the candles burning low. His captains whispered of victories, of Farad'n ships burned, of cargoes seized. But they also whispered of losses, of ships that vanished in the mist, of convoys caught and slaughtered, of captains who never returned. "It is war," the prince whispered, his voice a low growl. "We are killing them. We are winning." But his captains didn't meet his eyes, because they knew the truth. The sea was a graveyard, and they were the ghosts. The Princess of Farad'n watched her city darken. The merchants whispered of ruin. The docks were lined with burned hulls, the markets quiet, the gold tainted with fear. "Fight," she whispered, "fight or die." But her captains whispered of shadows, of ships that sailed without lights, of whispers that twisted in the mist. "They are everywhere," they whispered. "They are nowhere." "They are dying," the princess hissed. "Bleed them, burn them." But her captains didn't answer, because they were already dead. The ships struck in the mist, iron against iron, cannons roaring, smoke twisting in the wind. Men fought in the rain, swords flashing, blood staining the decks, but they fought without hope. Because the war was not just on the sea, it was in the whispers, in the shadows, in the silence that followed every battle. A Valerian captain, his face lined with scars, stared into the mist, his hand gripping the hilt of his blade. He watched the shadows twist, saw the faint glow of lanterns in the fog. "Ready the guns," he whispered. But his crew was silent. "Ready the guns!" he shouted, his voice sharp, his heart pounding. But they didn't move, because they were dead. Their bodies lay twisted on the deck, their eyes open, their throats cut. The captain staggered back, his breath coming fast, his chest tight. And in the mist, he saw them. Faces, pale, watching, silent. He drew his sword, his hands trembling. "Stay back," he screamed. "Stay back." But the mist swallowed his words, and they didn't stay back. In Farad'n, the princess's guards whispered of shadows, of men who vanished in the night, of ships that burned without warning, of whispers that twisted in the dark. She walked the docks, her cloak pulled tight, her eyes cold. "It is fear," she whispered. "It is a weapon. Break it. Kill it." But her captains didn't answer, because they were already dead. The Prince of Valeria stood by the cliffside, watching the gray sea, his hands clenched behind his back. His captains spoke of victory, of ships burned, of ports taken. But he saw the ash on the wind, saw the gold stained with blood, saw the smoke that never faded. "It is over," he whispered. "We have won." But the sea didn't answer, and the ships kept burning. The war wasn't a war, it was a curse. It was a shadow that twisted in the mist, that whispered in the wind, that drank blood without ever dying. Men whispered of ghost ships, of captains who never aged, of shadows that walked the decks. But they sailed. Because the gold still flowed. Because the kings still smiled. The king of Valeria lay dying, his face pale, his breath thin. "Business," he whispered. "Only business." But his son didn't listen, because he knew the truth. It was not business, it was war. A war without a name, a war without end. The old king of Ferredin died in his golden bed, his fingers clutching a silver goblet, his eyes staring at the ceiling. Gold. It is all gold. But the princess didn't cry, because she knew the truth. It was not gold, it was death. The ships burned, the sea turned black, and the whispers never stopped. The sky over the sea was a curtain of gray. Smoke twisted in the mist, waves crashed against burned hulls, and the wind carried whispers, faint, broken cries lost in the cold air. But the ships kept sailing. They sailed with iron-clad hulls, their decks lined with cannon, their sails stained with ash. They sailed with captains who wore iron beneath their coats, with sailors who carried blades and whispered prayers. They sailed because they had nothing else, because the sea was all that was left. The Prince of Valeria stood on the cliffs, his cloak whipping in the wind. His father was dead. The golden throne stood empty. The palace was quiet. But the war didn't stop. His captains spoke of victory, of Ferredin ships burning, of merchants drowning in the mist, of cargoes taken, of gold spilling from shattered hulls. But the prince saw the blood, saw the ships that limped home, their sails torn, their decks scorched, saw the sailors with haunted eyes, men who drank themselves blind to forget the faces of the dead. "It is over," he whispered. "We have broken them." But his captains didn't answer, because they knew the truth. It wasn't over. It would never be over. The Princess of Ferredin stood by the burning docks, her father buried in a golden tomb, his coins scattered on the marble floor. Her city whispered of ruin. Her merchants spoke of vengeance, her captains bled, but she didn't weep because the war didn't end. Her ships sailed in darkness, iron against iron, cannonballs roared in the mist. Her captains whispered of victory, of Valerian ships burned, of sailors drowned. But she saw the fear, saw the shadows that twisted in the fog, saw the smoke that never cleared. "It is not enough," she whispered. "They will not stop, not until they are broken." But her captains didn't answer, because they knew the truth. They were already broken. The sea was a graveyard. The wreckage drifted beneath the gray sky. Ships burned without names, iron hulls twisted, masts shattered, corpses tangled in the waves. But the whispers didn't stop. Men spoke of ghost ships that sailed without lights, of shadows that walked the decks, of captains who spoke in voices that were not their own. They spoke of faces in the mist, of whispers that twisted in the wind. But they sailed, because they had nothing else. Because the gold still flowed, because they were already dead. The prince stood in his war room, the maps spread before him, the candles burning low. His captains whispered of losses, of convoys shattered, of ironclads sunk, of men who vanished in the mist. "Burn them," the prince whispered. "Sink them, break them." But his captains didn't meet his eyes, because they knew the truth. They were already broken. The Princess of Ferredin walked the silent halls of her palace, her captains whispering of ruin, of ships that never returned, of ports burned in the night, of merchants who fled with their gold. "Strike first," she whispered. "Strike hard. Take their ships. Take their blood." But her captains whispered of shadows, of ships that burned without flame, of captains who smiled in the mist. "It is madness," they whispered. "We are already dead." But she didn't answer, because she knew they were already dead. The sea turned black. Ships shattered in the mist, their masts twisted, their hulls crushed. Cannons roared, iron smashed against iron, swords flashed in the rain. But the men who fought were ghosts. They fought without hope, without names, without faces. They fought because they had nothing else. Because the war didn't end. Because the whispers never stopped. The Prince of Valeria stood on the cliffs, the wind tearing at his cloak, his eyes cold and empty. His captain spoke of victories, of ships burned, of ports taken. But he saw the ash in the air, saw the gold stained with blood, saw the men who sailed without names, who fought without faces. "This is not victory," he whispered. "This is death." But his captains didn't answer, because they were already dead. The Princess of Ferredin walked the burning docks, her captains speaking of vengeance, of victory, of Valerian ships shattered. But she saw the bodies in the waves, saw the ships that never returned, saw the smoke that twisted in the wind, the ash that stained the sails. "It is over," she whispered. "It must end." But her captains didn't answer, because they knew the truth. It would never end. The wind whispered through the empty harbors, the smoke twisted over the waves, and the ships sailed. Iron against iron, cannonballs roared, men bled. But the gold was gone, the markets were empty, the cities whispered of ghosts. The sea was a graveyard, and the whispers never stopped. The Prince of Valeria stood alone on the cliffs, his cloak torn, his hands empty. His city was quiet, his docks were silent, his ships were gone. "It is over," he whispered, his voice thin, his eyes empty. "It must end." But the wind didn't answer, and the sea whispered of shadows. The Princess of Ferredin walked the darkened halls, her voice a whisper, her eyes hollow. "It must end." But the sea didn't answer, because it was over. But it never ended. The ships burned in the mist, their sails twisted, their decks shattered. Men fought in the rain, their screams lost in the wind, their bodies swept beneath the waves. But they fought without hope, because the war had no name, because the war had no end, because the war was all they knew. The sea was a graveyard. The wind whispered of ghosts, and the whispers never stopped. So, if one day someone ever told you that wars must end, remember this story. Some wars never end. They just become whispers.